Now, this example, of course, is way too crowded. It lacks composition, but the reason why I'm showing this anyways is because I have 3 buttons in my Aro script, in my add-on, and I'd like to show you examples for all 3 buttons. So one of them will be able to distribute objects along a straight line, and the other button can be used to distribute objects along a path, like the spiral here, and the third button will be able to include armatures. And you can see that the smileys are actually, some of them are waving with their left hand, some of them are waving with their right hand, and of course there's only been one mother smiley from which all the others derived. So let's have a look. Hello and welcome to this BlenderDiplom tutorial. My name is Frederik Steinmetz, and today I'm actually very excited to present to you my very own add-on. I have started to develop this add-on a couple of months back, and you could actually follow the development along, but you had to know Python, or at least be not afraid of the text editor. So I can understand if that was weird for some people because they just don't want to get into Python or any coding language that much. So now there's good news. I made an add-on out of this. And if you want to use my add-on, you have to download the file from the link below. And then in your Blender, press File and User Preference, or just Ctrl-Alt-U. And then under Animation, you will see the Aro. You can enable it. And don't worry about the warning sign, it just says this is an alpha version. So if there are any mistakes or unexpected behavior, go to the system console. If there is not an explanation on why it's behaving weird, feel free to drop me an email and I'll look into it. Okay, so once it's enabled, you get in the tool shelf, the T menu. Here, press T to get that. You get 6 new buttons and a list. And by now, the operator buttons, those are grayed out. So I'll have to add a mesh or an object to actually replicate, because Aro is the animation replicator with offset. And now that I've modified it to have 3 different types, it doesn't even need an animation anymore to make sense. You can also use it for other stuff. I'll show you in a minute. Now, with the preparation for this, it is a good idea to have your object to have a rotation of 0, 0, 0 and 1, 1, 1 in the beginning of your animation. It doesn't need to be, but you will run into some weird problems if it isn't. Possibly. So to avoid weird behavior, you should press Ctrl A and apply the rotation. The Suzanne, since, I don't know, 2.68 comes with an initial rotation of 90 degrees once you add the primitive, which I don't like because it makes things weird with my add-on. Anyways, once you have an object selected, the linear offset button appears and you can click it. And you can see that you get 2 more monkeys, which is here, 2 more monkeys. And iterations is a mathematical term for how often you do stuff. And you can see that the dimensions of the monkey are in X 2.734. So if I want a location offset so they barely touch, but they don't intersect, I'll just paste this. You can hover over this value with Ctrl C and then hover over this with Ctrl V pressed, and then you end up, well, copying the value over there. And since it's the location offset of exactly the dimensions, they will now be perfectly aligned. So the location offset is fairly self-explanatory. You can make it 3D, but I guess you usually wouldn't, because having them in a straight line sort of makes more sense. But yeah, feel free, of course, to toy around with the values. And you can see the way add-ons or any operator in Blender works is you get down at the T menu, you get this list of settings. The parameters of these settings, I define them. So you can alter your operator, alter what you just did by adjusting the values. And unfortunately, once you've pressed anything else that can be undoable, meaning if you used any other operator, then these options will be gone, unfortunately. Okay, so that's the location offset. Let's delete those again and let's make an animation, because it's an animation replicator. Just look at this from the top and I'll press I for a rotation keyframe. I'll go to frame 21. R180I rotation again, and if I look at this from the front now and scrub through the die, I can see my monkey turning his head. Okay, now let's press this linear offset again, and it will actually store the last settings that you've used, which is very handy if you just have to change a few options and then rerun. You don't have to go through all of this again. Blender will store what you did last time. Okay, so iterations and location offset, we already covered that, but now we have an animation to actually work with, and the offset frame actually refers to your animation. And if I scrub through this, you can see we have 10 frames offset, so at frame 11 this one should start turning, and it does. Okay, so we can make more copies. So this is basically an array with the option of animating it. Okay, so this can actually look quite cool if you have a lot of objects doing a lot of doing the same thing but offset in time, like a choreography or something. I actually wanted to, oh, that was bad. I pressed A and that's not good. Let's do that again. Okay, so you can see you can scrub through the timeline to test your animation, which is perfect, but you can't press A. Okay, so if I set the offset frame higher, obviously the monkeys would start spinning earlier or later, depending on if I set it higher or lower. So let's set this to 0. 0 is a special case because if you set this to 0 and the random offset to something like 50, then in the course of 2 seconds, 25 frames, all the monkeys should have started spinning in a random order, and you can see they do. Okay, you can also combine it, of course, the offset frames with the random offset. For example, if you put this to 1, then you can see some of your monkeys already start spinning, and that is because if you have a random offset and the offset frames are not 0, then it will offset it by, let's say, 10 frames, and then it will add or subtract 25 to that number, because 25 is exactly half of this. So random offset of 50 means a random range around the next starting frame of 50 plus minus 25. So if you have this at 10, you are likely to have some of your heads turn before you get to frame 1. So if you want to avoid this, it's not necessarily something you do want to avoid. Actually, I can see cases where you wouldn't want to avoid it. If you want no keyframes on negative frames, you need to set this to 0. And now all the monkeys start straight, and then they start turning, and after 2 seconds they all started turning, and after 70 frames the last one must have continued. Okay, so let's have a look at the other settings. Location offset, we already covered that, and let's have a look at rotation offset. If I turn this, you can see I can sort of make the monkeys into a spiral. Let's make a couple more, and you can see they are like spiraling. And of course you can do that in all axes. You can see, and if you use several axes, you can actually have a pretty funny result. So this is the offset of the next copy in degrees. And if I do this now, you have a very random motion. Well, now let me just quickly tell you something about the inner structure of this, because if you haven't followed the other 2 Python tutorials that I made, this add-on is actually going to the delta transform of your objects. For example, if I click this one, let's make this a little less crazy. So you can see that the delta location here, this is what changes. Which means that if you have a keyframe on an object, you can still use the Arivo. Let's put a cone here, and let's have a look at its location. I'll make this 0 so it's easier. And we can only look at the Z coordinate. If I now put a location keyframe here, and then I'll move it anywhere else, and press right arrow, left arrow, change frame, anything, it will jump back, of course, because there's no other keyframe. So it will update to this keyframe. If I use the delta location, I can still move it, but you can see the location stays the same. Delta is a Greek letter for capital D. It means difference. So every action that is done by the offset or by Arivo is going to the delta location and rotation, and with the object and armature offset also to the delta scale if you want to. Now the big advantage is that you can animate your object in any way, rotation, location, keyframes, and so on, and the offset will still work. However, if you keyframe the delta location, rotation, or scale, then the offset will not. So just leave the delta alone and you're fine. I mean, most people don't use it anyways, and it's just came in very handy when I thought, let's use it. Okay, let's do something different now. I'm going to add an empty. Empty of, it doesn't matter what it looks like, but I'm going to put it to be a sphere, because with a sphere you can easily guess the dimensions. Now I'm going to add in a plane. I'm going to edit mode and rotate it 90 degrees around the x-axis. Okay, so, and again in edit mode I'll scale it up and press G, Z and 1, which places it exactly on the x-axis. Okay, we can still continue to make this smaller. Let's do something like this. Okay, so let's also decrease the size of our sphere so it matches the width. Plus minus a tiny bit more. Okay, there we go. Now we go to location -10 and press I to make a keyframe. Then we go to the location 101. So exactly 100 frames. And again, make a keyframe, but this time at +10, not -10, so, and we press T to make this linear, so we travel at a constant speed. Good. So over the course of 100 frame, our empty now moves 20 Blender units, so it's 0.2 Blender unit per frame. If you don't want to do all the math, you can have a little trick called DupliFrames. If I click frames here on the duplication in the object menu, there will be a copy of this object from each frame in the interval 1 and 100. Meaning, Blender will go to all those frames, determine the position of this object, and sort of make a shadow, slightly grayed out version of this empty all over the place, which is great for using with the Arivo. It doesn't work with parents, which is what I'm going to tell you a little bit down the road, which is one more reason why we actually need the Arivo so badly. Okay, so if I were to use this path here that I'm creating with my empties, or with the one empty animated, we can now use Arivo to produce one of these on each stage of the path. So let's shrink this down just until it fits in between two of those. Okay, there we go. And now let's just choose this empty here, and this is the tricky part. I apologize for that, but I have no idea how to make this more intuitive and still keep all the functionality. So you'll have to bear with me on this one, unless you have an incredible and awesome idea to tell me, dude, this is the way. Do it this way. Okay, if I really like it, I'll do it, I promise. But for now, you'll have to bear with me. I'm just going to call this placer. I think I already have a placer in the scene. No, I don't. Great. So let's just select it here. So it doesn't matter what you call it. You can just select it here. And once you select a placer object, the object offset actually becomes usable. Now if I select this and choose object offset, it will basically be very slow. And I actually just learned something myself. If you have a lot of going on in your scene, then the Arivo will be very slow even though this stuff isn't visible. I'm not entirely sure on why that is, but for example, if I click object offset now, it still has the 200. And you can see I can just scrub through this, so there is no speed problem whatsoever. However, before I deleted some of the other tutorial, this was really slow. So Gottfried actually used 3000 copies and was still rendering and working very fast. So please keep that in mind. Keep your scene simple, and then after you're done doing all the Aro stuff, either import the rest of your stuff or just keep working. Just start working then. Okay, so we've already covered iteration, offset, frame, random, offset. Now we have a couple of more options. For example, starting frame. If you hover over any of these, I made tooltips, so they should explain what's going on. If not, well, that's what the tutorial is for. If you hover over start frame, it says it's the starting time of the path or animation for the placer object, not this object, placer object. Meaning, obviously, the first copy of this will be put exactly where our empty is at frame 1, which is exactly here. The second one will be put exactly here, and so on. So, if you increase the start frame, we got this one weird thing. I'm working on that, don't worry. But in general, what you can do with a starting frame is actually determine where your chain will start. If I take this down to 20 and toy around with the starting frame, you can see that it's basically doing the same thing except for it offsetting it in space. So I guess that makes sense. And if you're using the spacing, this basically same thing. It also goes with the placer animation, not your animation. It will skip every other frame. So here's one, here's none, here's none, here's one. So every third frame will be evaluated. If you put the spacing to 3. If you put the spacing to 0, they're all at the same place, so this doesn't make sense. Leave it at 1, and one hint at this time, if you make your animation too slow rather than too fast, you still have some control in here. Okay, so let's put this back up to 100. And this option actually we had in the linear offset as well. I just forgot to mention it. Create parent. If you create a parent, then you got an empty in the middle of the scene, and all the objects are parented to that empty. It's very handy if you want to. Just experiment, and later on you decide, well, that was very nice, but let's put them just a tiny bit to the left. You can do that with the create parent option. The hide render option means that, you know, the original object, I turn this down, the original object will be independent from the chain. So it will still exist in space. It doesn't matter where it is, but you can choose not to have it rendered, which in my eyes just makes sense. And don't worry, even if it was hidden before you pressed the object or Armature offset, your copies will not be hidden. I switched them back on. So I'd recommend you to leave the hide render on unless there's a specific reason why you want your original to be rendered as well. You can actually double check that here. You can see the camera is off. That's the icosphere. That's the plane. There we go. Hide render is off for the plane. If I turn this on, it gets turned on. Okay, so hiding the render just makes sense. And the inherit scale and inherit rotation is what I wanted to explain next, but I need to do some more preparations for that. Okay, let's, for example, insert a scaling keyframe at the beginning and also one at the very end. Now I'll go to the middle and insert another one. Now I'm going to delete X and Y scale and only leave the that was location. Scaling, okay. I'm going to delete the Y and Z location and the X and Y scale, which leaves us with a Z scale and the X location. Okay. If I move this up, you can see in real time how my objects get influenced by that, which I find very cool. Now, if I was to move this, let's say here, you can basically see an equalizer forming in front of your eyes. Now, if I use my, I'll hide this. You don't need to see the placer. It can be on a different frame, doesn't matter. Just make sure it exists. And then press the object offset again, and we have the same result as before. Let's turn this up to 100. And we'll click Inherit Scale. And there you go. It follows the scale just like your empty does. I'll hide this. Okay. This is like exponentially higher. Let's have a look at this. Scale is 1, but it's very, very thin. So let's just make it shorter compared to how thin it is. And there you go. See, this is what I was talking about. It remembers your options, so you can press undo, make some minor modifications, press object offset again, and you're basically where you started off. So there's a minor limitation of this being an add-on and not a modifier. You can, I hope, work your way around that. Okay, so actually I like this thing. I'm going to leave it for later. Let's go to another frame. And let's have a look at the inherit rotation. I'm going to make a new empty again. And this time I'll go to frame 1, press I on the location, and I'll go to the Z location. And this time I'm going to use a generator. Generator just makes it continuous motion. This is way too fast, so I'll put it to 0.1. And this will generate a linear motion on the Z-axis, which makes it travel up there. Okay, this is too slow. Oh, that should about do it. I can always, just forgot, I can always double check with my dupli frames. And dimensions, I'll put them to 0.2. It's important. You saw what happens when I animate the scale and put inherit scale in there, which means if you don't want to change anything, leave the scale at 111 or animate it. For the visual representation, choose to shrink the size, not the scale. Okay, so now scale 0.2, and this is 0.4. 0.2 is the radius, so it's 0.4 in dimensions. So that makes perfect sense. I'm going to add an icosphere and scale it down, move it to the left. Scale it down some more, like so. Now I'll press period, Shift D, SX-1, and Control N. Okay, so we got two icospheres, and this is a trick that comes in handy a lot of times. You can mirror something by scaling it to the -1 around along its X or Y or Z axis, for example. Okay. We have created a new empty. I'll call this spiral. So spiral will spiral, but right now it doesn't actually. It needs to rotate. I forgot. It needs to rotate. Okay. I'll select it and I rotation, and then on the Z rotation I'll make another generator modifier. And let's there you go, you can see it's rotating. Let's see if there's a better way to visualize rotation, like a cone or something. Oh, there we go. Now we can see it's twisted. Very nice. So it's a little exaggerated, so I'll put the influence down, something like that. Yeah, that looks about right. Okay, so we'll take the spiral here. And we'll choose object offset again, and you can see it's following in a straight line, of course, but there's no twisting. And this is where the inherit rotation comes in. You can disable inherit scale with inherit rotation, and that will get us a nice helix spiral. Okay, so I'll undo this still, and I'll get some rotation on this. So just I rotation, and then I'll go forward, I don't know, 10 frames, 11 frames. I'll rotate it 10 degrees. This is arbitrary values. You can choose whatever you want. And you can see me deleting a lot of these values if I don't use them. This is just a habit from game engine stuff, because if you don't need a keyframe or an IPO or an action in the game engine, please delete it. It's very consuming. So here, if you have 3000 copies, I guess you can save some time if you don't use your empty XY rotation and only use the Z. This is not necessary, this is just a habit. Okay. Linear extrapolation. So this is basically the same thing as an generator, but there's a difference for our script. You can see if I move these, in X, meaning in time, these rotate. But if I grab this keyframe and move it, that was the shot of the location. If I grab this keyframe, is there a keyframe? There's no keyframe. Okay, generator replaces the keyframe, so they can't get offset. Meaning, if we want to offset the rotation, we actually have to work with keyframes and extrapolation. Okay. So now this is rotating. Let's do this again. Object offset. Okay, we got a spiral, and if I scrub through the timeline, the spiral is rotating. Okay, that's cool. So let's have a look at one more option before we get to the armature offset. I'll use a Bezier curve, and I'll just scale it up a lot. Move the handles around so it's a little bit more interesting. And here we go. Now I'm going to make an empty follow this curve. I'm going to use arrows so I see where the empty is pointing. Control P, follow path. And it does weird things. Alt O will fix that, and with Alt O it will be exactly along the path. But we need to align it so it's actually also pointing along the path. Now, like this. And now it's following the path, pretty much exactly right. Okay. And then I'll create a disk, and this is actually what Godfrey did in this preview video. He used a disk, and then he used an empty to follow path just like that, and baked the sound to the scale of the empty. And that caused the different shape, the different sizes in his disk, in the music video animation. Okay. So if I now go to the object options of the placer, actually let's call this, I don't know, pather, just so we know it's following a path. And I'll check frames. You would imagine, or you would expect the empty to be duplicated along the path, but nothing happens. So unfortunately the dupli frames cannot take into account any parenting relation, which is unfortunate, because I was actually hoping to make or to align objects along a path using dupli frames, but it didn't work because of the parenting relation. So good news, one of the side effects of variable, it can also replicate objects without animation. So just select your correct empty here, choose object offset, and that makes it kind of flat. You can see inherit rotation is on already because of the last time we ran it, and if it's off it looks like this. And if you inherit the rotation, it does follow the path, but it's 90-degree offset. So if we want to actually make a sausage along the path, we'd have to rotate this by 90 degrees. So what do? We just assume we did everything right, go into edit mode and rotate this 90 degrees. There we go. It's following the path exactly. Perfect. And this taught us something else about the Aribo. Aribo is making instances. Instances have the huge advantage of rendering very, very fast. And they have the other advantage, keeping the file size low, which is basically the least important one of all the cool features it has. But also, if I give this a material, one thing obviously all the others get the material as well, because the data block is shared 101 times. Once plus 100 copies. Okay, so if I set this to smooth, same thing happens to all the objects. And of course, UVs. If you forgot to unwrap this before you pressed object offset, no problem. Just go back and unwrap it. It'll count for all of these. Any changes in edit mode will be applied to all of them, which is perfect again. And if you don't want to have them all one, you can just select them all, and say object and data, and then you get 100 different objects. It will increase your render time, but now you can give them separate UVs, separate colors, separate materials, and so on. So I guess that's it for object offset. You can also use it to arrange objects along a path. So let's head over to the armature offset. So there's one button left, the armature offset. For this you need, of course, an armature. So I modeled the smiley, and it has an armature, and it can wave. There you go. Hello. And I want this smiley to be replicated 50 times, to be distributed all over the place, to wave randomly, and most importantly, I don't want all of the copies to wave with the left hand. Some of them should wave with the right hand. Yeah, that's it. And I want all of this to be done with a single click of a button. Well, the end result will be the single click of a button, but we have to prepare for this. But don't worry, it's not that much. Let's insert an empty with arrows. And I'm going to make a keyframe location. And this is, of course, going to be my placer object for this example, so I need to animate it. And I want this to go all over the place, so I'll use a noise modifier. Noise modifier makes it shake. There we go. But that's just a tiny shaking. So let's adjust the size so we can have a comparison. Yeah, something like that should be fine, so we know how big our smileys are. And if I go back to frame number 1, we can see it wiggling around the origin. So the scale here is actually referring to how far those spikes are apart. So the smaller, the faster the wiggle. So the smaller the scale, the faster the wiggle is. Not that important for us. What we want is strength. I want a lot of it. I want 50. Okay, so this is a pretty big wiggle. Now wiggling back and forth, and let's enable the dupli frames, and we can see they're distributed randomly along the x-axis. Okay, so we can copy this so we don't have to paste in the number all the time, and just paste it and paste it again, and now something weird happened. Even though our 3 values here are totally random, those things form a straight line. 45 degree here, 45 degree here. And the reason for that is all these lines are the same. They are wiggling wildly, but every x, y, and z value is the same because we pasted this. As long as all the numbers here are exactly the same, the wiggling will also be the same. So we could either do something about the strength, or we can just use the phase, which is basically the seed of the random input. I'll just use these two, and I'll make them 5 and 10, just some random numbers, and there we go. They're distributed randomly. If I were to click our armature offset now, well, we get an error message because we have to use a name here. Let's just give this a name. But still, even if we select the jumper here, now we wouldn't get an error message anymore. But all our smileys would be waving with the left hand. And I want some of them to wave with the right hand. What I'll do for that is I'll shut off the speaker here so it doesn't wiggle anymore, just so I can see. Shut off the eye so I don't have anything distracting here. And I'll press I and insert a scaling keyframe. I'll delete the Y and Z scale. And over here we can see scale is 1. And I'll advance 1 frame and I'll type in -1. I'll go over here with my mouse, press I and choose only selected channels. Now you can see we have 2 keyframes, one at 1 and one at -1. I want them to be constant. I guess there's not that much of a difference because they're all always just one frame apart. There's not much interpolation going on, but just to be on the safe side, and also I don't want the handles if I don't need them. So I'm going to select this one, Shift D and 2. And that will place it 2 frames down the road from its original. So this is scale 1, scale -1, and scale 1. There we go. We can now use another modifier, cycles, and there you go. We have it jumping back and forth between 1 and -1. Exactly what I wanted. I'll now enable this again, and also we can show it again. Now this is colorful, pretty. Okay, nice. Now I'll go back to textured, and I'll select my empty, my smiley, and also its armature. The jumper is selected, we're ready to do it. Press Ctrl S. Armature offset. And the armature offset has the default values. If I scrub through this, they start waving, but they're all waving with the right hand. So let's increase the number of copies, 50, and you can now see it's starting to actually take some time. So whenever you're using not an armature and only one object, if you can fuse them, Ctrl J, if you have to use multiple objects and or armatures, then you use the armature offset with a twist. Well, not a twist, a little trick. If you choose mute modifier, which is a button the object offset doesn't have, because it doesn't support modifiers in the first place, then our subsurf modifier gets disabled. Actually, all modifiers get disabled except for one, the armature. So if you want to increase performance, you can just mute the modifiers. And if you want, you can uncheck this at the last step once you're happy, or you can go back and choose this button to re-enable them. I'll show you this in a second. Now we have our speed up going, and you can see this is actually not lagging anymore. It's in real time. Perfect. But they're all waving, well, they're all waving 10 frames down the road. Well, offset, I don't want that, I want random offset. So I'll set this to 0 and this to 100. So we have, over the course of 4 seconds, everybody will have waved. But they're all waving with their left hand. So let's choose inherit scale. That'll make some of them flip. And there you go. They're waving with their left hand now. At least some of them. I'll just enable this. And there we go. Okay, I guess that's it for this exercise. I can then select all of them, hide this just so it's prettier, and if I select all of them and choose enable modifiers, then the subsurf gets turned on again, which is very handy if you have a couple of modifiers and you don't need them temporarily. Just mute them, and then you can see here's an armature, it will not be touched, and the subsurf, which will be touched. So if we enable them, subsurf gets turned on for all of them, and now it's a little laggy. Mute them, and now it's real time. So there's one button left, which is the apply modifier. And the apply modifier is especially handy if you have a lot of linked copies. For example, we have 51 of these. And I probably mentioned this before, but if you have a rendering in Cycles and in Blender Internal as well, but in Cycles it's much more noticeable. If you render linked copies, instances of each other, it will greatly increase the render time, in render speed I mean, and also it will save you a lot of RAM. So whenever you can, try to have linked objects. Now if you use a modifier on this linked object, and for example I'd like to make them solid, because right now if you look at them from the side you can't see them, so I'll add some thickness, this much, to make them all squares. And this of course works for every modifier, it just needs to be the first one, as you can read here. Only the uppermost modifier will be applied, and of course I could go ahead and press Ctrl L and choose modifiers. That will copy the modifier to all of them. But that's not very render effective because they are still linked. You can still see it's 51 of those instances, but they will be unlinked once you press render, because the modifier will be applied, well, in theory, for the rendering, and that will make it a new object, because Blender can't know that they all share the same modifier. It'll just apply the modifier and make each into a new mesh. So what you want to avoid is using modifiers on multi-user objects. So if I were to then apply the modifier, then I could just change the geometry of all of them. In theory, if I do this and go out of edit mode, I've done it for all the objects. But if I want to press apply modifier, I'll get an error message because modifiers can't be applied to multi-user data, which is where my button comes in. This one is used to apply the modifier on this object and then pass the changes on to all the other objects. I'll just do that. And you can see we have two options. We can remove the existing modifier or we can remove the same type. If I remove the same type, there we go. You can see them from the inside. They create another of these bars inside the other bar. So here you can see it. If I remove the same type, it will check what type my modifier was that I actually applied here, and on the target objects it will remove that modifier. If you are sure, and this is actually something you should do, I just unchecked it because it's a little bit more dangerous. If you choose remove existing, it will remove all modifiers from your other objects. So you probably want this option, but just in case, I also gave you the option of only removing the same type. For example, if you want to keep an armature on them, but you want to apply the subsurf or something. So that's it. Speed up tools, all the buttons explained. I hope this was useful for you, and I hope you can do great things with my add-on. I'd be very interested to hear or to see if someone came up with a nice thing they've done with. And until next time, my name is Frederik Steinmetz, and this was a tutorial for BlenderDiplom.com.